Welcome to Gradeful. Here we have one of the tougher math scenarios that's been showing up on the SAT as of late. Before we get into explaining it, I'm first going to give you about 60 seconds to at least give this question a try. Be sure to have a paper and a pencil if you're giving it a try, and hopefully a graphing calculator or at least Desmos. Go ahead and give it a try. All right, let's go ahead and start answering this question now. Before we get into the specifics of this question, let's talk about two rules that you need to know for your next SAT. The first one is this one. We call it the T rule. It says that if you have an altitude to the hypotenuse of a right triangle, which is what this question type is all about. By the way, an altitude is a segment like this one here that goes from the vertex of a triangle to the opposite side, hitting it at a right angle. So that segment that I just shaded, that's the altitude to the hypotenuse because it's hitting the hypotenuse of the outer triangle at a right angle. So that's the altitude to the hypotenuse. Now, when you're dealing with the altitude to the hypotenuse, if you have three segments in the shape of A, B, and C here, then the T rule says that you can say A over B equals B over C in that order. Or you can do it in the opposite order, no difference. You can say C over B equals B over A. And that's the T rule. Right here, it looks kind of like an upside down T. So let's go ahead and just write that out. A over B equals B over C. Or, like I said, you can do it in the opposite direction. C over B equals B over A. So that's the T rule, and we're going to use that rule. The other one we call the swoosh rule because it looks like a Nike swoosh. For that one, you need to find the place where the hypotenuse of the outer triangle is being split into two parts, not two equal parts, because we don't know if they're equal or not, but the hypotenuse is being split into two parts. From there, you go toward one of the legs, up the leg, make a U-turn, come back down the leg, and across the hypotenuse. So it's maybe easier if you think of it as a Nike swoosh. So you go toward a leg, up the leg, make a U-turn, and come back down the leg, and then back across the hypotenuse. So once again, you start at the place where the hypotenuse is broken. This is the hypotenuse of the whole outer triangle, right? So you start at the place where that hypotenuse is broken, and you go toward one of the other sides of the triangle, the legs. You go up that leg, make a U-turn, come back down that leg, and then go across the entire hypotenuse. So if I didn't make it look enough like a Nike swoosh, I guess I'll do that right now. We can say A over D equals D over A plus C. So let's write that. A over D equals D over the whole hypotenuse. And just like the T rule, it can be done in the opposite direction as well. We can say C over E equals E over the whole hypotenuse that way as well. So let's write that. Let's say C over E equals E over the whole hypotenuse. So you got to know those two rules. You've got to practice them a little because they're not the easiest things to just learn and apply. But let's go ahead and start answering this question based on that. So we've got our altitude to the hypotenuse of the right triangle. We know that AB equals 56. So let's mark that on here. Okay, AB is 56. And the first thing we can do in this question is use the Pythagorean theorem. Just the good old-fashioned a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And if you don't know already, a and b are the two legs of the right triangle, and c is the hypotenuse. So let's just call this x right now. So we can say 48 squared plus x squared equals c squared. But actually our hypotenuse is 56, so let's put that in there. 56 squared. And 48 squared is 2,304 on the calculator. And 56 squared on my calculator is 3,136. Now we're going to take away the 2,304 from both sides. So 3,136 minus 2,304 gives us 832. And now we can just take the square root of that. X would be the square root of 832. So we'll label that here, root 832. Okay, so next we'll make a little space here so that we can work on the next part of this. So let's shrink this down, move it clear out of the way. Now that we know for a fact x is the square root of 832. So I'll maybe change the color of my pen for the next thing we're going to do. And now what we can do is we can do the actual swoosh rule here. Remember, you take the hypotenuse of the whole triangle, which is right here. You go toward one of the legs, up that leg, make a U-turn, come back in the opposite direction, and then across the whole hypotenuse right there. So let's call this piece here y, and this piece here, which we'll use later, z. But using that Nike rule, the Nike swoosh rule, we're not sponsored by Nike. I'm kind of a little afraid of that, to be honest. But using that rule, we can say y over 48 equals 48 over 56. And that's our sort of rotated Nike swoosh there. So let's write that out. Y over 48 equals 48 over the whole hypotenuse, 56. Now we can cross multiply. 56y equals 48 times 48, 48 squared, which is 2,304. Now we can divide both sides by 56, and we'll get 2,304 divided by 56. Now, a major skill you want to have on some of these harder SAT questions is to divide out a fraction on your calculator or on Desmos, get a decimal, and then use your calculator function to turn it back into a fraction. So on my TI-84 that I have here, I'm just hitting math 1 and enter. And it's telling me that this is the same as 288 over 7. So here we have 288 over 7, and that's going to be the value of y. So let's mark that right here. 288 over 7. And let's go ahead and shrink this work so we can do some more work. Get that out of the way. Put it over here somewhere. Okay. And so now, we know the whole hypotenuse is 56. And we know that the piece we just found is 288 over 7. So if we subtract that, we'll get the value of z. Because we're just taking away what we just found, which is part of the hypotenuse, from the whole hypotenuse, and we'll get the leftover piece. So once again, the same important skill, which is to subtract or do any kind of math, get a decimal answer, and use your calculator to turn it back into a fraction. And my calculator just told me that z is equal to 104 over 7. 104 over 7. Let's write it here as well. Let's shrink that down so we can do some more work. Work, work, work. Never ends. Trust me, guys, when you become adults, you go off to college, and afterward, you always have to be a hard worker in life. So we've got y and z, and now let's call this other piece here, let's call this w, and we're going to solve for w right now using the t rule, because the t rule tells us that y over w equals w, start over, y over w equals w over z. That's our t rule for the altitude to the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So let's go ahead and do that. Y over w equals w over z. And we have two of those. We've got y, which is 288 over 7, over w equals w over 104 over 7. Shrink this down a little because I wrote too big, but it's fine. And now when we cross multiply this, we have w times w squared equals, and I'm not going to multiply it out. Sometimes there's an advantage to not multiplying things out. So 288 times 104 over 7 times 7. Now, what's the advantage of not multiplying this out? The advantage is that when you take the square root, you can take out perfect squares. So for instance, if you take the square root of something, what you're asking is what number multiplied twice gives me that number. For instance, square root of 25 is 5 because 5 times 5 equals 25. So we're dealing with the square root of 288. So 288 is 144 times 2. 144 is 12 times 12. So 288 is 12 times 12 times 2. That's the 288 right there. 104, well, that's 52 times 2. And let's take that even further. Let me just take another second to resize my work here. Okay, so 104, I'm just going to do this off to the side. 104 is really 52 times 2. 52 is really 26 times 2. 26 is really 13 times 2. And if you're someone who needs help simplifying radicals, then welcome. And so 104 is really 2 to the third power, there are 3 of them, times 13. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that here. 2 times 2 times 2 times 13. Okay, so we have the square root of all that stuff over the square root of 7 times 7. Okay, so now we can take out any pair of numbers. So we have a 12 and a 12. That can come out as a 12. We have this 2 and 2 right here. That can come out as a 2. And we have this other 2 and 2 right here. That can also come out as a 2. So, just to recap that, this pair of 12s came out together. This pair of 2s came out together. And this pair of 2s came out together. But there was a 13 that did not come out. So right now we have a root 13 right there. And on the bottom, we're looking for pairs of numbers, 7 and 7. So we can just go ahead and say 7, a single one, comes out of the radical there. So now, just multiplying what we have outside of the radical, 12 times 2 is 24, times 2 is 48. So putting that all together, we've got 48 root 13 all over 7. And that's because 12 times 2 times 2 is 48, root 13 all over 7. And what we just found is W here. So let's fill that in. 48 root 13 all over 7. And let's go ahead and make some more space. I'm just noticing I moved the B, but I had actually moved the C a long time ago. So CD is W, and DB is Z. So now that we found W, we can do the ratio of W to Z. So let's do that. W on the top, Z on the bottom. We just found W, 48 root 13 all over 7. All over 7. And Z was always 104 over 7. So if you haven't done this in a while, to divide one fraction by another, let's say we had A over B divided by C over D. Well, that's keep, change, flip. You keep the first one the way it is, you change it to multiplication, and you flip the second one. So AD over BC in this example here. So then in ours, we would keep the first one, 48 root 13 over 7. We would flip the second one, 7 over 104. And of course, we changed it to multiplication. So doing this, the 7s are canceling. And in my calculator, I'm going to put 48 on the top and 104 on the bottom, get a decimal, and then use my calculator to turn it back into a fraction. And that's 6 over 13. So that multiplies out to, or that simplifies out to 6 and 13. 6 on the top, 13 on the bottom. That's 48 over 104. And then root 13 coming along. And so in decimal form, 6 root 13 divided by 13. That's 1.66. And that is the answer. So if this were a College Board question, if it were sort of formatted that way on something with a radical in it, you'd probably have multiple choice. So this wouldn't be a free response question. But if you're one of those few people who got 6 root 13 over 13 or 1.66, and there are some more decimals there, but if you got that as your answer, congratulations. And if you didn't, well, you're in the right place, because this is what SAT prep is all about, finding something that you need to work on and making yourself an expert on that. So either way, you should be really proud. You should be really grateful or grateful. And if you enjoyed this, if you feel like this is helping you toward your college dreams, be sure to like this video. Thanks so much and have a great day.